Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always love imagining these stories traveling across different cities, quiet towns, and sleepless rooms, where someone out there is listening with their heart open. When people looked at Eleanor Whitmore in her old age, they saw a woman who had become almost invisible to the world. She was the kind of woman others forgot to notice in grocery store lines, the kind who folded her reusable bags with care, counted coins without shame, and smiled softly even when no one smiled back. At 68, Eleanor had a back that ached in the cold, fingers stiffened by arthritis, and a face that carried the gentle ruins of a hard life. But there had been a time, many years ago, when that same face was bright with hope, and when she still believed that love, sacrifice, and endurance would one day be repaid in tenderness. She had been only 32 when her husband, Martin, died. It happened in late November, just a month before Christmas, in the kind of accident people described in one sentence and forgot by the next week. Martin worked at a packaging plant just outside town. A machine malfunctioned. There was shouting, confusion, sirens, and by the time Eleanor arrived at the hospital with 8-year-old Daniel clinging to her coat, Martin was already gone. For a long time after that, Eleanor could not remember exactly how she had remained standing. She only remembered Daniel's small hand in hers. "Is Dad coming home tomorrow?" he had asked that night, sitting on the edge of their narrow bed in the apartment they could barely afford even with Martin alive. Eleanor had knelt in front of him, her throat burning as if she had swallowed broken glass. "No, sweetheart," she had whispered, trying not to frighten him with the sound of her own grief. Dad's not coming home anymore." Daniel's face had crumpled in confusion first, because children did not understand death until they had already stepped into its shadow. Then came the crying, deep, frightened, helpless crying, and Eleanor had gathered him into her arms while her own tears soaked into his hair. From that night on, she made herself a promise she never once broke. Daniel would not be destroyed by the life that had destroyed so much of hers. She gave up the idea of remarrying before anyone even had the chance to suggest it seriously. She gave up sleep, comfort, ease, vanity, and later, pride. She took whatever work she could find in the small New England town where they lived. In the mornings, she cleaned rooms at a roadside inn just off the highway. By lunchtime, she hurried to the elementary school cafeteria, where she wore a hairnet and ladled soup onto trays, while pretending not to notice when children threw away food she knew could have fed her for a day. At night, after Daniel fell asleep, she hemmed dresses, repaired zippers, and patched torn jackets for neighbors who paid her in small bills or sometimes in casseroles. There were winters when the heat stayed low, and both of them wore sweaters indoors. There were evenings when Eleanor told Daniel she wasn't hungry because she had already eaten at work, though in truth she had only drunk tea to quiet the ache in her stomach. She learned how to stretch a roast chicken into 3 days of meals, how to mend shoes from the inside so no one would see, how to smile when creditors called, and how to keep fear from entering her voice when Daniel asked innocent questions about money. He was a bright boy, serious beyond his years, with his father's dark eyes and a nervous habit of chewing the corner of his sleeve when he worried. One evening, when he was 10, he came home with a school field trip form. "Everyone's going to Boston next month," he said, trying to sound casual. "It's for the Science Museum." Eleanor took the paper and saw the amount due. It was not a fortune, but that week it might as well have been. Daniel must have seen the pause in her face because he quickly added, "It's okay, I don't really care about it." Eleanor looked up at him. "Did you want to go?" He shrugged too hard. Not really, but she knew that shrug. A week later, after taking on extra laundry work from 2 women in the next building, she tucked the field trip fee into an envelope and placed it beside his cereal bowl before school. Daniel stared at it. "Mom, how?" "Don't worry about how," she said lightly, tying back her hair. Just promise me you'll look at everything and tell me all about it when you get home." That night, Daniel returned full of stories. Planets, engines, skeletons, and some machine that could turn static into sparks. Eleanor listened as if he were reading poetry. She asked questions she barely understood because she loved the light in his face when he explained things. That was how she mothered him, not with abundance, but with attention, not with wealth, but with relentless devotion. As Daniel got older, Eleanor's hopes attached themselves to every small sign of progress. Good grades, a teacher's praise, a scholarship application, a neatly ironed shirt for the bait club. She became a quiet architect of his future, building it with exhaustion and faith. When Daniel was 15, he came home embarrassed after another boy mocked his thrift store blazer and old shoes. "I'm not going back to that debate thing," he muttered, throwing his backpack onto the floor. "You are," Eleanor said, from the kitchen table, where she was pinning the hem of a church dress for a customer. "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." He turned to her sharply, frustration bright in his face. "You don't get it. They all have nice things. They have cars and jackets and money to go out after. I'm tired of looking like—" He stopped himself. "Like what?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Like I'm poor." The room became still. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she folded the dress in her lap and looked at her son with a tenderness so steady it made him uncomfortable. "Daniel," she said, "there is no shame in being poor. Shame comes from being cruel, dishonest, or ungrateful. Never confuse those things." He looked away. She softened her voice. "You go back tomorrow, you stand up straight, you speak well, and you let them learn that a good mind does not care what label is stitched inside a jacket." He gave a small, reluctant nod. Years later, she would remember that conversation often, not because she had failed to teach him, but because somewhere along the way, life had taught him something louder. By the time Daniel was in his final year of high school, Eleanor had become known in town as one of those women who could always be relied upon. She never spoke bitterly, never borrowed without repaying, never missed a shift unless she physically could not stand. The principal at the school where she worked once said, if everyone had half of Eleanor Whitmore's character, the world would be a kinder place. Eleanor had laughed softly at that. Kindness, in her experience, was rarely what moved the world, but it was what kept a person human. Daniel earned admission to a respected university in Boston with partial scholarship support. The day the letter arrived, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times before the words fully settled in her chest. "I got in," Daniel said, voice shaking. "Mom, I got in." "You did," she said, and then she began to cry. He smiled, half laughing, half overwhelmed. "Mom, don't cry." "I'm allowed," she said, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I've earned this cry." That night, they celebrated with a small bakery cake bought on discount just before closing time. It leaned slightly to one side, and the icing was imperfect, but to Eleanor it looked more beautiful than any grand dessert she had ever seen in magazines. University years were not easy. Even with scholarship help, there were books to buy, transportation to cover, emergencies to survive. Eleanor took on even more work, and Daniel, to his credit, studied hard and worked part-time. At first, he called often. He told her about professors, internships, city life, the thrill of being around people who talked about law, finance, and politics as if the whole world was theirs to shape. But slowly, without either of them naming it, something began to shift. Daniel started correcting the way she pronounced certain words. Then he started calling less. Then, when he did call, he sounded washed, distracted, faintly irritated by the smallness of the world he had come from. One Thanksgiving during his university years, Eleanor cooked his favorite meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic, and the apple pie Martin used to love. But Daniel arrived late, dressed too sharply for the little apartment, and spent half the evening texting. "Everything okay?" Eleanor asked, setting a plate before him. "Yeah, just work stuff." "You're still in school?" "It's internship stuff, Mom. It matters." She sat across from him, watching him glance around the apartment as if seeing it from a stranger's eyes. "Do you still like the pie?" she asked. He took a bite. "It's good." Just good. Not wonderful, not just like before, not the pie he used to beg for every autumn. Eleanor smiled anyway. Mothers often smiled through the first ache long before anyone noticed they had begun hurting. Still, she never let herself become cynical. She clung to memory, to the image of the little boy who once ran to her after school with scraped knees and spelling tests. She believed adulthood was simply a demanding season, and that one day her son would return to himself. After graduation, Daniel found success quickly. He entered the legal world, moved into a better circle, and learned how to dress, speak, and carry himself among people who had never worried about grocery money. Eleanor was proud, truly proud. She told everyone in town about him. She framed his graduation photo beside Martin's old watch and the church portrait taken when Daniel was 10. When Daniel introduced her to Vanessa for the first time, Eleanor tried with all her heart to welcome her. Vanessa was beautiful in a polished, expensive way, with smooth blonde hair, perfect posture, and a smile that seemed warm until one looked too closely and realized it never reached her eyes. She came from money, the kind that produced effortless confidence and subtle impatience toward people who did not know the right wines, the right neighborhoods, the right posture of belonging. Over dinner at a restaurant Eleanor could not afford but insisted on contributing to, Vanessa asked pleasant questions in a voice that was almost musical. "So, Eleanor," she said, stirring her drink, "have you always lived in that same town?" "All my life," Eleanor answered. "How quaint," Vanessa said with a smile. Daniel laughed softly, not cruelly, but not protectively either. Eleanor felt that laugh more than she let herself show. Still, she reached for grace. It may be small, but it was a good place to raise a child. Vanessa lifted her glass. "Well, you clearly did something right." The words sounded complimentary, but somehow Eleanor left that dinner feeling measured. As the years passed, the distance between Eleanor and Daniel no longer felt like an accident of busyness. It felt curated, managed, smoothed over in polite phone calls and holiday visits that grew shorter each year. Daniel never said he was ashamed of her. He did something more painful. He acted as though she belonged to another era of his life, one that should be acknowledged discreetly and kept at the edges. Eleanor bore it the way she had borne everything else, quietly. She moved into a smaller apartment after rising rents forced her out of the old place. Her arthritis worsened. She continued taking in sewing jobs from neighbors, though threading needles had become harder. Some nights she sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking at the streetlights and wondering when exactly her life had grown so narrow. And yet, when December came and Daniel called to invite her for Christmas at the home he now shared with Vanessa, hope stirred in her again, like something stubborn and undying. "Come early," Daniel said on the phone. "Vanessa's family will be there too. It'll be nice." Nice. It was not a warm word, but Eleanor held on to it anyway. After the call, she sat in silence for a while, then opened the small tin box where she kept her savings. Inside were carefully folded bills, a few coins, and a list of things she needed to buy before winter deepened. She looked at the money for a long time, then she whispered to the empty room, "Maybe this year will be different." And because mothers can remain hopeful long after wisdom tells them not to, Eleanor decided she would not arrive empty-handed. She would bring thoughtful gifts, not because anyone there deserved her effort more than before, but because giving with love was the one part of herself she had never allowed the world to take. She just did not know yet that the Christmas she was preparing for would become the dividing line between the life she had endured and the life she had not yet imagined. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. There is something strangely beautiful about imagining hearts in different places, listening to the same story at the same hour, each carrying their own memories of family, silence, and the holidays. Christmas morning arrived with a sharp, pale cold that made the world outside Eleanor Whitmore's apartment look almost delicate. Frost clung to the edges of the window, and the bare trees across the street stood like thin gray hands against the winter sky. Eleanor had been awake since before dawn, not because she had anywhere urgent to be, but because sleep had come lightly to her, the kind of light sleep that belongs to people who are hopeful and anxious at the same time. She stood in her small kitchen, pouring hot water into a chipped teacup, listening to the quiet hum of the radiator. On the table beside her sat the gifts she had prepared over the past 2 weeks. They were wrapped neatly in plain but tasteful paper she had bought on sale. One box held 2 hand-knitted scarves, one in deep forest green for Daniel, the other in cream and gold for Vanessa. Another held a set of heirloom ornaments Eleanor had carefully polished and retied with velvet ribbon. They were old glass pieces, delicate and beautiful, passed down from Eleanor's own mother. She had hesitated before giving them away, but part of her had thought that perhaps this was how families stitched themselves back together, through gestures of trust, through giving something that mattered. She dressed slowly, taking care with each step. Her navy wool dress had been pressed the night before. She wore her modest pearl earrings, the ones Martin had bought her at a pawn shop many years ago, when Daniel was still a toddler. She pinned back her silver hair and applied a small touch of lipstick. Then she looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. "You are not going there to beg for love," she murmured quietly to her reflection. "You are going there as his mother." The drive to Daniel and Vanessa's home took just under an hour. Eleanor did not own a car anymore, so Daniel had arranged for a car service to pick her up, something he mentioned over the phone as though it were a grand kindness. Eleanor had thanked him, though privately she suspected he simply did not want his mother arriving in the gated neighborhood in a town taxi that looked too ordinary for the polished world he now inhabited. When the car finally turned into the development, Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The houses were enormous, each one decorated with professional holiday lighting, so perfect it almost looked unreal. Wreaths bigger than her old apartment window hung on glossy front doors. Reindeer sculptures glittered on manicured lawns. Daniel's home stood near the end of a curved cul-de-sac, its columns trimmed with white lights, its entrance framed by garland and ribbons so lavish, Eleanor briefly wondered whether Vanessa had hired someone to decorate the place the way department stores dress their windows. The front door opened before Eleanor could ring the bell. Daniel stood there smiling, handsome and expensive-looking in a charcoal sweater and pressed trousers. For one fleeting second, Eleanor saw the little boy he had once been. Her heart warmed at once. "Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, darling," trying not to sound too emotional. He took the gift bags from her hands, though not without glancing at them first. "You didn't have to bring anything." I wanted to. He stepped aside. Come in. Everyone's already here. The warmth of the house hit her immediately, along with the layered smells of cinnamon, roasted meat, pine, perfume, and expensive candles. Voices drifted from the living room. Laughter rose and fell in smooth, confident waves. The polished wood floors gleamed beneath the chandelier light, and every surface looked curated: silver trays, crystal bowls, velvet bows, monogrammed stockings. Eleanor followed Daniel farther inside, careful not to let her boots leave melted snow behind. Vanessa appeared moments later, in an elegant burgundy dress that fit her like it had been made for her alone. Her hair fell in perfect loose waves, and not a single detail about her seemed accidental. Eleanor, Merry Christmas,
Vanessa said brightly, air-kissing the space beside Eleanor's cheek. You look lovely. Thank you, dear, Eleanor said. And you look very beautiful. Vanessa's eyes moved to the wrapped items Daniel had set near the tree. Oh, you brought gifts. That's sweet. There was nothing openly rude in the words, but Eleanor heard it all the same, that faint note of surprise, as if generosity from someone of Eleanor's means were quaint, almost theatrical. The living room was full of Vanessa's relatives. Her parents, Lawrence and Camille Hargrove, stood near the fireplace with drinks in hand, looking like the sort of couple who had spent years mastering the art of seeming gracious while assessing everyone in the room. Vanessa's younger brother, Bryce, lounged on a leather chair with the careless confidence of a man who had never had to earn his ease. A few aunts, uncles, and cousins moved in small, elegant clusters, speaking over one another about ski trips, market investments, and a New Year's gathering in Aspen. Daniel began introducing Eleanor around, though most of them had met her before. "This is my mother, Eleanor," he said. Camille gave her a smile. "Of course, we're so glad you could join us." Lawrence nodded. "Always nice to have family together." Eleanor thanked them both, though she noticed how quickly their attention slid elsewhere. She had long since learned the difference between welcome and politeness. Lunch was served in a dining room so formal it made Eleanor sit straighter than usual. The table was laid with layered china, polished silver, folded linen napkins, and tall candles flickering in glass hurricanes. Eleanor found herself seated midway down the table between one of Vanessa's aunts and Bryce, who smelled faintly of cologne and wine even before the meal was fully underway. Conversation flowed quickly around her. Vanessa's relatives filled the air with stories about luxury travel, renovations, and private schools. Every topic seemed to be designed to establish rank. Eleanor answered when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and focused on her food. Daniel participated easily, almost eagerly, as though he had rehearsed himself into belonging there. He laughed at the right moments, offered opinions in the same polished tone as Lawrence, and corrected a waiter-like catering assistant when the wine pairing was momentarily mixed up. At one point, Camille turned to Eleanor and said, "Daniel tells us you still do sewing work?" "A little," Eleanor replied. "Mostly alterations for neighbors now." "How quaint," Camille said, lifting her glass. "It's rare these days to see people keep up such old-fashioned skills." Bryce snorted softly into his drink, and though Eleanor could not have explained exactly why, the comment settled over her like dust. Not enough to stain the day by itself, but enough to remind her that she had entered the room where everything about a person was assigned value. After lunch, everyone moved toward the tree in the formal sitting room. Christmas music played softly in the background. Someone lowered the lights so the tree glowed more brightly, its ornaments sparkling beneath strands of white light. Vanessa clapped her hands once, delighted. "This is my favorite part. Daniel, start with yours." Eleanor stood slightly back at first, watching. Gift bags and wrapped boxes were passed from hand to hand. There were designer handbags, engraved watches, cashmere coats, concert tickets, fine jewelry, and an antique decanter for Lawrence. Each present was unwrapped with admiration so loud and theatrical that Eleanor almost felt she was attending a performance rather than a family holiday. Still, she kept her smile in place. When it was Daniel's turn to present his gift to Vanessa, the room changed. Even before the box was opened, everyone seemed to sense this one mattered more than the others. Daniel handed her a cream-colored envelope inside a lacquered red box. "This one," he said with a grin, "is for my wife." Vanessa gasped before she even opened it, already thrilled by the drama. She unfolded the documents inside, and then both hands flew to her mouth. "No," she breathed. "No way!" "What is it?" Camille exclaimed. Vanessa's eyes glittered. "A Mediterranean cruise? 2 weeks, suite level, private excursions. Daniel!" The room erupted at once. Lawrence let out a loud laugh of approval. Camille clasped her hands and said, "That is an extraordinary gift." Someone else asked how much it cost. Bryce whistled low and muttered, "Now that's a present."
Vanessa held her wine glass at chest level, smiling with that bright, polished amusement she wore whenever someone else was about to be made smaller. Daniel looked uncomfortable now, though not yet alarmed. "You can just hand it to me, Mom. I'll check it." "No," Eleanor said quietly. It was not a dramatic word, it was almost soft, but something in the room shifted at once. She took the folded paper slip containing the winning numbers from the side table where someone had left it after checking another relative's ticket earlier. Then she began reading. The first number matched. No one reacted much at first. Small matches happened. Eleanor blinked and looked again, making sure she had not mistaken it. Then she checked the second number. That one matched too. Bryce straightened. Vanessa lowered her glass slightly. Daniel's brows drew together. "What is it?" I think these first two match," Eleanor said, her voice uncertain. Camille gave a breezy laugh. "Well, maybe there's enough there for a nice dinner." But Eleanor was already looking at the third number. When that one matched as well, silence fell so quickly it felt physical. "Daniel," she said, now no longer able to hide the tremor in her voice, "would you come here, please?" He crossed the room at once, the first real urgency in his movements all day. Eleanor handed him both the ticket and the paper. He studied them once, then again, his face changing so dramatically that even Vanessa noticed before he spoke. "What?" Vanessa asked. "What is it?" Daniel did not answer at first. His mouth parted slightly, the color began draining from his face. "Daniel," Eleanor repeated, almost frightened now, "am I reading it wrong?" He looked up at her, and for the first time in years there was no polish in his expression, no social ease, no smoothness at all. There was only shock. "No," he said hoarsely, "you're not reading it wrong." Vanessa stepped closer. "Daniel?" He swallowed. It's all of them." Nobody seemed to understand immediately. "All of them what?" Bryce asked. Daniel looked around the room, then back at the ticket, almost as though the paper might change in his hands if he blinked. "All the numbers match." The words landed like a pane of glass shattering in absolute stillness. Camille let out a tiny involuntary sound. Lawrence took a step forward. Vanessa stared, not yet comprehending. One of her cousins actually laughed once, lightly, as though surely this must still be part of the joke. Then Daniel said very clearly, "This is the jackpot." Eleanor felt the room tilt. She reached for the nearest chair and lowered herself into it before her knees gave way. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears so loudly that for a moment she could barely hear the wave of voices breaking around her. "That can't be right. Check again. How much is it? Oh my God!" Bryce snatched the paper from Daniel, then checked the ticket himself, his mocking energy gone entirely. "Jesus," he muttered, "it really is." Vanessa took the ticket next. Her manicured hands shook. No, wait, there has to be. But there wasn't. The same ticket she had laughed at, the same ticket Daniel had handed over as a joke, as an afterthought, as a small public insult carefully disguised as family humor, was worth millions. Eleanor sat frozen in the middle of the room, surrounded by expensive furniture and the sharp scent of pine candles, while everyone who had laughed at her only minutes before stared as if she had transformed into someone unrecognizable. Daniel knelt in front of her suddenly. "Mom," he said, too fast, too breathless. "Mom, are you all right?" That question might have touched her if it had come earlier in the day, but now it sounded strange, almost desperate. Eleanor looked at Daniel, then at the faces around her. Vanessa's smile had vanished entirely. Camille's social brightness had been replaced with calculation so naked it almost made Eleanor shiver. Lawrence kept adjusting his cuff as though he did not know what to do with his hands. Bryce, who had joked about a retirement plan, now stared at Eleanor with stunned respect, or perhaps envy. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "I would like some water." At once, 3 people moved. Vanessa turned toward the kitchen. Daniel rose. One of Vanessa's cousins offered, "I'll get it." Eleanor noticed all of it. Not because she wanted to, but because the contrast was too brutal to ignore. An hour ago, she was the poor old mother who could safely be laughed at. Now she was a woman everyone suddenly wanted to assist. Daniel returned with water first and placed the glass carefully in her hands. "Sip slowly," he said. This is unbelievable." Eleanor drank, though her fingers trembled so much she nearly spilled it. Vanessa sat beside her on the sofa, closer than she had been all day. "Eleanor," she said, her voice now honey-soft, "this is extraordinary. I mean, goodness, what a miracle. You must be in complete shock." "I am," Eleanor answered truthfully. Camille knelt near the coffee table, her eyes bright in a new and unsettling way. "We should call the lottery office first thing in the morning. No, maybe tonight if there's an emergency line. Lawrence, isn't there someone you know who handles these sorts of claims?" Lawrence cleared his throat. "Possibly. We could certainly help guide the process." "We." The word brushed past Eleanor like a cold draught. Daniel sat on the arm of the chair nearest her. "Mum, listen to me carefully. Don't tell anybody else yet. We need to handle this the smart way. We need to protect you." Protect her? Eleanor looked down at the ticket again, now resting on the table between them, and something sharp moved inside her. Not anger exactly, not yet, but awakening. She could still hear the echo of Vanessa's laugh. She could still hear Bryce saying it might buy her something nice. She could still see the amused expression on Daniel's face when he had handed it over. The miracle of the ticket had not erased any of that. It had only illuminated it. "I'll be careful," Eleanor said quietly. Vanessa placed one hand over Eleanor's wrist. "We're family. You don't have to carry any of this alone." The warmth of that hand felt unbearable. An hour later, the gathering had lost all resemblance to Christmas. Dessert plates sat half-finished on side tables, wrapping paper remained in soft heaps by the tree, but no one cared anymore. The air had become electric, every conversation circling Eleanor, money, logistics, possibilities. Daniel drove her home himself that evening, insisting the car service was no longer appropriate. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said as they pulled away from the house. Snow had begun to fall lightly, coating the windshield in a fine silver mist before the wipers pushed it aside. Anything could happen. If someone found out. "No one knows except the people in that house," Eleanor said. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "And they won't say anything." The confidence in his voice made Eleanor turn slightly. "Will they not?" she asked. He glanced at her, then back at the road. "Mum, you know what I mean." For several miles they rode in silence. Then Daniel said, in the careful tone of a man trying to rearrange the emotional furniture of a conversation, "I'm sorry if the gift came across wrong." Eleanor stared out the window at the passing dark. "Came across wrong?" He exhaled. "You know what I mean. It was just holiday teasing. Vanessa's family jokes like that. They didn't mean anything by it." Eleanor let that sit between them. Then she said, "And you?" He was quiet for a moment. "What about me? Did you mean anything by it?" Daniel's jaw moved slightly. "Mum, come on."
"No," she said. "Answer me." He gave a short breath, almost annoyed. It was just a lottery ticket. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Before it became something else, it was just a lottery ticket. So I'm asking what it meant when you gave it to me." Daniel said nothing. That silence hurt more than a bad answer would have. When they reached her apartment building, he parked and turned toward her. The snow outside had thickened now, dusting the parked cars and softening the edges of the street. "I want to help you," he said. Eleanor studied his face. She knew that face better than anyone once had. She had kissed that forehead when it was feverish, bandaged those hands when they were scraped, prayed over that sleeping child in dark rooms while creditors waited and grief sat like a second body inside her. But tonight she saw something else too, something urgent and hungry rising behind her concern. "I'm sure you do," she said. He frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Eleanor answered, unfastening her seatbelt with slow hands, "that tonight taught me many things at once, Daniel. Some of them I am still learning how to name." He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize more fully, perhaps to explain, perhaps to reach past the discomfort and reclaim some old tenderness, but Eleanor was too tired now for unfinished truths. "Good night,"
she said. Inside her apartment, the quiet wrapped around her at once. She locked the door, set her handbag on the table, and stood in the middle of the room still wearing her coat. The apartment looked the same as it had that morning. The narrow sofa, the lamp with the slightly crooked shade, the little framed graduation photo of Daniel, the folded throw blanket, the sewing basket by the chair. But Eleanor no longer felt the same inside it. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table and placed the ticket in front of her. Then she cried. Not the loud, dramatic crying of movies, not the sobbing collapse of a woman overwhelmed by fortune. It was the deep, shaking grief of someone who had just realized that fate had not only opened a door for her, but had done so in the very room where she had been least cherished. When she finally looked up, her eyes landed on Martin's old photograph in its simple frame. "You would not believe this," she whispered. And perhaps because she was exhausted, or because Christmas has a way of making the dead feel strangely near, she almost imagined what he might have said. Not about the money, about her. About the fact that life had, for once, placed something extraordinary in her hands after asking so much from them both. The next morning began before sunrise. Daniel called first. "Mom, don't do anything until I come over," he said. "I've already looked into a few firms that help with lottery claims." Then Vanessa called. "Eleanor, darling, I barely slept," she said. "I kept thinking how overwhelming this must be for you. Why don't you stay with us for a few days? You shouldn't be in that apartment right now." That apartment. Eleanor looked around her kitchen as Vanessa said it, and something in her cooled. Then Camille called. "Sweetheart," Camille said warmly, using an intimacy she had never once shown before. "Lawrence and I were talking, and we know an excellent wealth manager. Truly excellent. We'd be happy to make the introduction." By noon, flowers had arrived. By early afternoon, Daniel showed up with pastries from an expensive bakery and a legal pad full of notes. Vanessa came too, carrying a designer coat she claimed Eleanor simply had to borrow for upcoming meetings, as if money had already started rewriting who Eleanor ought to look like. They sat in the apartment that had once embarrassed Daniel, speaking rapidly about trusts, tax strategies, privacy, investment protections, and safe neighborhoods. Eleanor listened. And the more they spoke, the more she noticed that nobody, not one of them, had returned to the real wound of Christmas Day. No one said, "We were cruel." No one said, "We laughed at you." No one said, "Before that ticket became valuable, we treated you as though you were disposable."
The apologies were all hidden inside concern now, buried beneath practical language and sudden devotion. At last, Eleanor lifted one hand and the room fell quiet. "I will get proper advice," she said. "Professional advice. Independent advice." Daniel was surprised. "Of course, that's what I'm saying." "No," Eleanor replied, her tone calm now in a way that surprised even herself. "You are saying you should guide me. Vanessa is saying I should stay with you. Your in-laws are saying they know the right people. Everyone seems to have become very interested in what happens next." Vanessa's expression tightened, though she kept smiling. "Because we care." Eleanor met her eyes. Perhaps Vanessa expected softness, gratitude, uncertainty, but what she saw instead made her sit back slightly. "I'm sure," Eleanor said, "that care and shock can look very similar at first." Daniel's face changed. "Mom!"
But Eleanor was already standing. For the first time in many years, she did not feel small in front of her son. She felt clear. And though the path ahead was still frightening, and though she did not yet know how to carry a miracle without being crushed by the hands suddenly reaching for it, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. The ticket had given her more than money. It had given her a first, sharp taste of freedom. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. Some stories feel heavier at night and clearer in the morning, but wherever you are, I hope you settle in for this part, because this is where the truth begins to cost everyone exactly what it should. The first year after Eleanor Whitmore won the lottery did not unfold like the greedy fairy tale Daniel and Vanessa had imagined. There was no dizzy collapse into luxury, no reckless spending, no mansion bought out of spite, no parade of jewels and sports cars meant to prove that life had finally chosen her. Instead, Eleanor did something far more unsettling to the people around her. She became calm. Calm in the way of someone who had spent most of her life surviving storms, and therefore had no desire to create one just because she now had the means. Within the first few months, she hired her own attorney, her own financial advisor, and her own accountant, none of whom had any connection to Daniel, Vanessa, or the Hargroves. She moved quietly but carefully, claiming the money properly, establishing a trust, paying what needed to be paid, and making one decision after another with the same quiet discipline that had once stretched grocery money through long winters. She bought herself a cottage near the coast. It was not the kind of home that would appear in glossy magazines or inspire envy in wealthy suburbs. It was smaller than Daniel's house, simpler than Vanessa would have ever chosen, but it was beautiful in a way Eleanor understood immediately. White shutters, a stone path, a porch that faced the sea, blue hydrangeas by the fence in spring, and salt wind all year. The inside had warm wooden floors, built-in bookshelves, a bright kitchen, and windows that made the afternoon light spill across the rooms like something merciful. The first night she slept there, she woke before dawn and sat beneath a blanket with a cup of tea, watching the gray line of morning rise over the water. No one was hurrying her, no one was laughing at her, no one was using kindness as a performance. For the first time in decades, peace did not feel like a temporary visitor. Her health improved, too. The arthritis in her hands had not disappeared, but now she could afford proper treatment, physical therapy, and specialists who actually listened when she described the stiffness and pain. She bought warmer coats, better shoes, a reading chair that supported her back. She no longer had to measure every need against rent, medication, and groceries. But the money changed more than her circumstances. It slowly returned parts of Eleanor to herself. She enrolled in literature classes at a local community center because years earlier she had once wanted to teach before life narrowed into grief and necessity.
She joined a small widows' travel group and took her first real trip in decades, not across an ocean, but through coastal towns she had only ever seen in calendars and postcards. She laughed more, slept better, began reading novels late into the evening without guilt, and because she no longer had to spend every minute earning survival, she found space for tenderness again, not only toward others, but toward herself. It was during one of the community lectures on local history that she met Thomas Avery. He was a retired history teacher, a widower, and a man whose kindness had none of the brightness or drama of performance. It was steady kindness, thoughtful kindness. He wore tweed jackets that smelled faintly of cedar, listened without interrupting, and had the rare ability to speak to Eleanor as though her mind, not her age or her money, was the most interesting thing about her. The first time he walked her to her car after class, he said, "You have a very sharp way of hearing what people mean beneath what they say." Eleanor smiled. "That comes from age." Thomas shook his head lightly. "No, that comes from having lived honestly." She did not know quite what to do with a compliment like that. It had been years since she had received one that did not hide something else inside it. Their friendship grew slowly. Coffee after lectures, walks by the water, long conversations about books, memory, war, marriage, grief. Thomas never asked about the lottery until Eleanor mentioned it herself, and when she did, he nodded once and said, "That explains the newspaper interest. It does not explain you." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," he said gently, "money is often the least interesting thing about a person. It only becomes the most interesting thing to those who lack character." She remembered that sentence for a long time. But while Eleanor's life became steadier, Daniel and Vanessa's began to fray in ways that were at first invisible from the outside. Their house remained immaculate, their parties remained polished, their social calendar remained full, but appearances are expensive, and people who live for appearances often do not notice the cracks until the floor beneath them begins to bend. Vanessa's luxury home styling business, which she had once described to Eleanor as the next big thing, failed within a year. She had overestimated wealthy clients, underestimated costs, and spent money faster than she earned it. Daniel, meanwhile, had grown used to a lifestyle that required constant feeding, club memberships, travel, expensive dinners, designer clothes, quiet competition with the richer men in his orbit. Together, they had built a life that looked prosperous and was, in truth, deeply unstable. At first, they approached Eleanor with subtlety. Daniel began calling more often. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he would ask. "Need anything around the house? I could come by Saturday." Vanessa started bringing little gifts, artisanal soaps, flowers, imported chocolates, and talking about family more warmly than she ever had before. One afternoon, over tea at the cottage, Vanessa smiled and said, "You've done such wonderful things with your money, Eleanor, really. The scholarships, the food program, the cottage, it's all so tasteful, so wise. You've inspired me, actually." Eleanor set down her cup. "Have I?" "Yes," Vanessa said, crossing one elegant leg over the other. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, about what it means to build something meaningful. Daniel, too." Eleanor said nothing. Vanessa went on. "We've been exploring a new investment opportunity, very carefully, very selectively. It's in real estate, but not in a vulgar way, more in a restoration and development lane, historic homes, boutique properties. It could be very profitable, but also beautiful, community-minded." There it was. Not yet an ask, but the clearing of the throat before one. "And why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked quietly. Vanessa's smile tightened for only a second. "Because family should share these things." A week later, Daniel called and dispensed with elegance altogether. Mom, I'm just going to say it directly, he told her. We've got a chance to get in on a property deal that could change everything. For whom? For us. Eleanor stood by the sink, looking out at the sea beyond her kitchen window. There is no us in a business proposition, Daniel. He gave a strained laugh. Come on, don't say it like that. How should I say it? You know what I mean. Yes, she replied. I'm beginning to. Daniel came to the cottage the following Sunday with papers in a leather folder and a tension in his face that made him look older than his years. The charm he wore so easily in public barely held. He spread documents across Eleanor's dining table. This would be secure, he said. We're not asking for a handout, just co-signing support tied to the property. Temporary leverage. 6 months, maybe a year. Eleanor stared at the paperwork. You want me to put my house behind your debt? Daniel exhaled sharply. It sounds uglier when you phrase it that way. It is ugly that way. He leaned forward. Mom, do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? She looked up. Do you have any idea how many years I lived under pressure without asking you to lose your home for me? That's not the same. No, it isn't. Because when I suffered, it was to keep a child alive. When you suffer, it is to maintain a lifestyle. His face hardened at once. You think this is about luxury? I think, Eleanor answered, that somewhere along the way you became unable to tell the difference between need and appetite. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at her. Then something snapped. You know what?
He said, standing so abruptly the chair legs scraped hard against the floor. You have become very self-righteous since getting that money. Eleanor remained seated. He laughed once, bitterly. All those years, I thought maybe once life finally gave you something back, you'd understand how the world works. But instead, you sit here in this cottage, handing money to strangers and acting like you're above your own family. Her voice was still calm, but it trembled at the edges now. The strangers I help have not mocked me, Daniel. He looked as though she had slapped him. Then he said the cruelest thing, not because it was loud, but because it was true enough to have lived inside him for years. I spent my whole adult life trying to escape what I came from. The room fell silent. Eleanor's hands folded slowly in her lap. What you came from, she said, each word measured, was not shame. Daniel's jaw tightened. You came from sacrifice, she continued. You came from work, from decency, from a mother who gave everything she had. If you found shame there, then you planted it yourself. He looked away first. That should have been the end of it. It should have remained one terrible argument between a mother and son whose relationship had already been poisoned by pride and entitlement. But Vanessa, frantic over their failing finances and increasingly desperate to preserve the appearance of control, made it worse. 2 weeks later, Eleanor's attorney called. Mrs. Widnor, he said carefully, I've received communications suggesting you may have made a written commitment to financially back a property loan for your son and daughter-in-law. Eleanor went cold. What? There is an email chain. There is no such commitment. That was my assumption, he said, but I'd like you to come in. The documents were waiting when she arrived. Printed emails, language that almost sounded like her if one did not know her well. Phrases about helping family, believing in their future, being willing to stand behind the project. But Eleanor had not written them. She did not have to wonder long who had. Vanessa had forged or manipulated an email chain, trying to create enough ambiguity to pressure Eleanor into compliance, or at least frighten her into settling quietly rather than face legal complication. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not because the plan was especially clever. It wasn't. Eleanor's real communications had been sparse, her attorney meticulous, and the metadata quickly exposed inconsistencies. But the audacity of it revealed something that could no longer be softened with family language. Vanessa had not simply wanted Eleanor's approval, she had wanted access. And if affection, politeness, and guilt had failed, she was willing to use deceit. When Daniel came to the cottage after the truth surfaced, he looked wrecked. "Mom," he said from the doorway, "I didn't know she was going to do that." Eleanor stood in the hall, one hand resting lightly on the banister. "Did you not?" He shut his eyes briefly. "Not that way. I knew she was upset. I knew she thought you were being unfair, but I didn't know she'd go this far." "Unfair?" Eleanor repeated softly. He ran a hand through his hair. "Please, don't do this." "Don't do what?" "Look at me like that." "How should I look at you?" He had no answer. The scandal did not stay private. Law firms talk. Bankers talk. Social circles talk more than anyone. Vanessa's reputation, built so carefully on taste and polish, cracked almost overnight. Daniel's standing at work suffered too, not because he had drafted the false emails himself, but because proximity to dishonesty leaves a stain in professions built on credibility. Invitations began to dry up. Calls slowed. People who had once admired them became politely distant. Their marriage, which had long depended on mutual performance, could not survive the truth. By the end of that year, they were living in separate parts of the same house, speaking mostly through clipped exchanges and attorneys. And Eleanor, standing at the center of the wreckage they had created around themselves, made one decision that surprised even Thomas when she told him. "You could press harder," he said one evening as they walked by the sea. Eleanor watched the tide pull foam back into darkness. "I know." "Then why won't you?" She took a long breath of salt air before answering. "Because punishment is not the same thing as peace, and I have spent too many years without peace already."
So she did not ruin Daniel further than truth already had. She did not chase revenge. She did not stand over the collapse and savor it. But she also did not rescue him. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore had to stand alone in the full shadow of his own choices. And Eleanor, wounded though she was, finally stepped back and let consequence do what motherhood never had: teach him exactly who he had become. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Some endings arrive like storms, others like candlelight, and this one, I think, belongs to the kind of evening where a person sits quietly and realizes that peace can come late, but still come beautifully. 2 years after the Christmas that changed everything, Eleanor Whitmore no longer measured life by what had been taken from her. That did not mean she had forgotten. People like Eleanor did not lose memory simply because time had passed. She still remembered the sound of Vanessa's laugh, the startled silence when the numbers matched, the bitter argument at her cottage, and the terrible stillness in Daniel's face when she told him he had mistaken sacrifice for shame. Some wounds, even healed ones, never disappeared completely. They became part of a person's weather, but they no longer governed her days. What governed her days now was purpose. The scholarship foundation she had established in Martin's name had grown far beyond what she first imagined. What began as a modest program for working-class single parents returning to school had become one of the most respected local charities in the county. Recipients came from difficult lives Eleanor understood instinctively: women who had left abusive marriages, fathers trying to finish nursing degrees while raising children alone, mothers who had spent years cleaning offices at night and now wanted certifications in teaching, bookkeeping, or healthcare. Eleanor did not simply sign checks and step away. She read their letters, attended ceremonies, remembered names, asked about children, deadlines, exams, and rent problems. She knew what it meant when a person's future depended not only on money, but on someone believing they were worth investing in. The pantry she had funded in Martin's memory had also become something larger than a charitable gesture. It was now a warm, dignified place attached to a community center where families could receive groceries, winter coats, school supplies, and even small holiday dinners without feeling stripped of pride. Eleanor insisted on that from the beginning. "No one comes here to be made to feel smaller," she had told the staff during one early planning meeting. "Need is already heavy enough. We are not going to add humiliation to it." Thomas, sitting beside her at the table then, had looked at her with that quiet admiration that always seemed to understand more than she had said aloud. By now, Thomas Avery was no longer simply her companion. Their marriage happened quietly, exactly as Eleanor wanted it. No ballroom, no curated guest list, no expensive spectacle performed for approval, just a small seaside ceremony on a bright spring afternoon, attended by a few close friends, scholarship recipients who had become dear to her, pantry volunteers, and neighbors who genuinely loved them. Eleanor wore a pale blue dress and a pearl necklace that had once belonged to her mother. Thomas, with his silver hair neatly combed and his kind, scholarly face softened by emotion, cried before she even reached him. When the officiant asked whether he took Eleanor to be his wife, Thomas answered, "With gratitude beyond anything I expected life to give me." Later, when they stood together on the porch of the cottage, while guests laughed inside over simple food and cake, Eleanor had rested her head briefly on his shoulder. "I never thought I would marry again." Thomas kissed her temple. "Life is often late with its gentlest gifts."
It was the kind of sentence Martin would not have said, and yet somehow that did not feel like betrayal. Eleanor had learned by then that love did not replace what came before, it simply made room beside it. Daniel's life, meanwhile, had moved in the opposite direction for a long while. His marriage to Vanessa collapsed exactly as people close to it had feared. The divorce was bitter, expensive, and full of blame so old it seemed they had both married one another in expectation of this ending. Vanessa refused to see herself as a villain, even after the forged emails and the financial desperation became impossible to deny. She claimed pressure had distorted her judgment. Daniel claimed he had been manipulated. Both statements contained fragments of truth and far larger portions of cowardice. Professionally, Daniel never entirely lost his career, but it stalled. In his world, public disgrace was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived as slower promotions, cooler partnerships, fewer invitations into the conversations that mattered. The elegant, upward trajectory he had once built his identity around began to flatten. He was not ruined. Eleanor had made sure not to pursue destruction for its own sake. But he was no longer protected by image, and for a man who had spent so many years worshipping image, that loss was profound. For many months, Eleanor heard almost nothing from him. At first, the silence hurt more than she expected. Even after everything, some part of her remained a mother waiting for footsteps, for a call, for evidence that the child she had once carried through grief had not vanished completely inside the polished, wounded man he had become. But over time, that silence also brought relief. She no longer braced herself for manipulative warmth, for carefully phrased requests, for conversations that treated her heart like negotiable property. She prayed for him, but from a distance. One December evening, nearly 3 years after the lottery, wind pushed softly against the cottage windows while Eleanor arranged candles on the dining table. The annual holiday supper for the scholarship recipients and pantry volunteers was only 2 days away, and she and Thomas had spent the afternoon preparing guest lists, menu cards, and little gift baskets for the children. The house smelled of orange peel, pine, and bread just out of the oven. Thomas was in the kitchen when the knock came. "I'll get it," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on a towel. She opened the door and froze. Daniel stood on the porch alone. The first thing she noticed was that he looked older, not merely in the face, but in the shoulders, in the way he held himself, in the absence of the sleek confidence that had once entered rooms before he did. He wore a simple dark coat dusted with snow and held nothing in his hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said, "Hello, Mom." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the door. "Hello, Daniel." He glanced downward once, then back at her. "I know I should have called first." "Yes," she said. "I almost did, a few times." The porch light caught the tiredness beneath his eyes. There was no performance in him tonight, no polished social tone, no strategic concern, just discomfort, humility, and something like fear. Thomas appeared quietly in the hallway behind Eleanor. Daniel saw him and straightened. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced." He nodded gently. "Good evening, Daniel." Eleanor stepped aside after a pause. "Come in, it's cold." Daniel entered the cottage slowly, as if he were entering a chapel or a memory he had no right to disturb. He looked around at the familiar warmth of the place, the bookshelves, the sea-colored walls, the brass lamp by Eleanor's reading chair, the framed photos of scholarship graduations, Martin's old photographs still kept respectfully on the mantel, and a newer wedding photograph of Eleanor and Thomas beside it. No one offered coffee immediately. No one rushed to fill the silence. At last, Eleanor said, "Why are you here?" Daniel took a breath. "To tell the truth, if I still can." Thomas looked at Eleanor. She gave a slight nod, and he quietly withdrew toward the kitchen, not to abandon her, but to give the moment privacy without leaving her unsupported. Daniel remained standing. "I don't want money," he said first, perhaps because he knew that was the most necessary thing to say plainly. "I'm not here for help. I'm not here because everything fell apart and now I suddenly remembered I had a mother. I know how that sounds, and I know I've earned every suspicion you could have."
Eleanor said nothing. His voice wavered once, then steadied. "I'm here because I have thought about that Christmas almost every day since it happened. Not the ticket, not the money. The moment before. The way I gave it to you. The way I stood there and let them laugh. The way I laughed, too." He swallowed hard. "And I don't think anything I ever lose will punish me more than knowing I became that man in front of you." Eleanor looked at him carefully, not softening too quickly, not hardening either. Daniel continued. "When Dad died, you gave me everything. I know that now in a way I didn't when I was younger. But instead of honoring what you gave me, I spent years trying to separate myself from it. I wanted people to think I came from polish, from ease, from the kind of family that never had to count rent money or mend clothes." He let out a breath that sounded almost like shame becoming audible. "I was ashamed of the wrong thing, not of poverty, of tenderness, of debt, of the fact that everything I had came from someone else's suffering." Eleanor's eyes filled, though she did not move. Daniel's own tears came then, sudden and unguarded. "I failed you, not only as your son, as a man. And I know an apology does not repair years. I know it may not even deserve to be heard, but it is true. I am sorry." The room held stillness the way some rooms hold music after it has ended. At last, Eleanor spoke. "I waited a long time," she said softly, "for one honest sentence from you.
Daniel closed his eyes briefly. She went on. You have given me more than one tonight. That matters. Hope flickered painfully across his face, but Eleanor lifted one hand before he could mistake mercy for erasure. Listen carefully, she said. I forgive you. He stared at her as though afraid he had misheard. I forgive you, she repeated. But forgiveness is not magic. It is not a door that opens and suddenly everything behind it is untouched. Trust is different. Trust returns slowly, if it returns at all. And if you want any real place in my life again, you will have to build it with humility, time, and action, not language. Daniel nodded at once, tears still on his face. I will. You will do it quietly, Eleanor said, without claiming closeness you have not earned. I understand. Thomas returned then, carrying 3 mugs of tea as though he had simply sensed the moment had reached its next shape. He set one down before Daniel without ceremony. The years that followed proved whether Daniel meant what he said. To Eleanor's surprise, he did. He began by volunteering anonymously at the pantry on weekends. At first, he stocked shelves, unloaded boxes, and carried winter coats to the storage room without telling anyone who he was. When paperwork issues arose for the foundation, contracts, compliance concerns, land use questions, he offered legal help without charging a cent and without attaching his name to publicity. He did not arrive asking to be called son in a room of grateful people. He arrived early, worked, and left quietly. The change was not theatrical. That was how Eleanor knew it might be real. Slowly, over months, and then over another year, she let him nearer, not back into the old place, because that place no longer existed, but into a new one, built from honesty rather than assumption. He came for occasional dinners, helped Thomas repair a section of the porch railing one spring, sat with Eleanor on the anniversary of Martin's death, and for the first time since boyhood, spoke openly of his father not as a vague tragedy, but as a man he missed and had failed to honor. One December, 4 years after the lottery, Eleanor hosted the largest holiday supper the cottage had ever seen. The pantry had expanded, the scholarship program had doubled, former recipients had returned with children now old enough to run laughing through the hallway. Volunteers brought casseroles, pies, breads, roasted vegetables, and cranberry dishes in mismatched serving bowls. Candles glowed in the windows. Snow fell gently outside. The cottage, once only a dream of safety, had become something even better. A place where people arrived not to perform love, but to live inside it for a few hours. Thomas stood near the kitchen doorway carving ham while telling one of his old classroom stories badly enough that half the room groaned and laughed. Eleanor moved from guest to guest with easy warmth, touching shoulders, remembering names, making sure no one felt overlooked. She wore a dark green dress and the same pearl earrings Martin had once given her. Age had softened her, but not diminished her. She looked like a woman who had suffered honestly and come through not bitter, but bright. A knock came at the door. When Eleanor opened it, Daniel stood there holding 2 loaves of homemade bread wrapped in clean linen. I thought store-bought would seem lazy, he said, almost shyly. Eleanor looked at the bread, then at him, and smiled. Well, she said, come in before it gets cold. He entered quietly, greeted Thomas with genuine warmth, and placed the bread on the table among the other dishes. No one stopped the room to announce him. No one made a speech. There was no grand gesture, only a place being made, naturally and without spectacle, at a crowded holiday table. Later that evening, as laughter rose around them and candlelight flickered across familiar faces, Thomas slipped one arm around Eleanor's shoulders. You all right? He asked softly. Eleanor looked around the room, at the families her foundation had helped, at the pantry volunteers, at Thomas, steady and beloved.
at Daniel in the kitchen, listening carefully as one scholarship student described law school applications, his face open in a way it had not been for years. At Martin's photograph on the mantel, still present, not erased, at the fullness of a life that had once seemed reduced to endurance alone. "Yes," Eleanor answered, and this time the word carried no hidden sorrow behind it. "I am." The cruel Christmas gift, meant to mock her, had once seemed like the sharpest proof of how little some people valued her. But in the end, it became the turning point, not because it made her rich, but because it made her free. Free to stop begging for scraps of love, free to build a life shaped by dignity, free to choose generosity without humiliation, companionship without fear, and forgiveness without surrender. And by the time that final Christmas evening settled into memory, Eleanor Whitmore understood that the greatest thing she had won was never the lottery at all. It was herself.